Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm joined today by
Amanda Anguish, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Oh yeah, I forgot to say I'm a psychiatrist. So today we are going to be talking about a very interesting topic, which is the top 4 traits of toxic people. The top 4 traits. So I hope you're ready for this because this is a very important topic and will give you some ideas of what to look for in a relationship and how to avoid some pitfalls that could get you into a lot of trouble later on. So Amanda, as we think about this topic, we're talking about toxic people. Some people call it maybe unsafe people. Actually, there was a book written by Henry Cloud and John Townsend, who are 2 psychologists. And the name of the book is Safe People. Yeah. And so they talked about, characteristics of safe people, unsafe people. And we're going to talk about some of their ideas and mix in some of our own ideas. But I'm curious, what do we even mean by this whole term safe or unsafe people? Is this kind of like, okay, you're a little kid, like, ooh, am I safe? Is someone out to get me? Or what are we talking about here?
Yeah, stranger danger, we talked about a little bit. And first I'll say that one of the reasons why this is so important to me and why I love that book came out is because so often I'm teaching my clients about boundaries, and I know we've done podcasts on that. But I find that a lot of my clients often grew up in environments where they weren't actually taught what healthy people look like. So it's almost like, well, here's your boundaries, but now they don't even know what to look for in people when they're putting those boundaries out there. And one of the reasons we have a hard time with boundaries is because of how other people respond to them. And so I think this whole concept of like safe people versus unsafe or toxic people is important because we're helping people understand like, what is the baseline? What should we be expecting from people versus what should we not expect from people when we want those people in our lives?
Now, what kind of things can happen when we allow unsafe or toxic people into our lives? Why is this such an important topic, really?
Well, in the worst case scenario, we'll start believing things that aren't true, and that kind of messes up with I like to call it like your GPS. Like, how do I know where to go when I don't even know what north, south, east, and west is? And somebody's telling me north is south or east is west and that sort of thing. So that's the worst thing that can happen. But sometimes people, if the wrong people are in our lives, can keep us from, fulfilling, I believe, our God-given purpose and stuff. And I've seen that happen where people have no direction in life because they're listening to the wrong people have influence on them.
Absolutely. And when I think about, all the work that I've done with clients over the years, the biggest thing that actually causes pain and destruction in people's lives is unhealthy relationships again and again, whether it's abuse, but it doesn't always have to be like over abuse. Sometimes it's, manipulation and control and all of these things. And it just can breed such unhappiness for people, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important that you mentioned that because sometimes where people want to go, we kind of want to do this all or nothing thing where, people are either all healthy or totally toxic and narcissistic and I can't be around them. Not everybody who is unhealthy is necessarily diagnosably narcissistic or psychopathic or sociopathic and stuff. So these are traits that oftentimes we can grow from and we can move towards being a safe person ourselves, but also too, we can recognize that if I'm in a vulnerable position, like I'm trying to heal, then maybe this person isn't the healthiest person to spend my time with, and I can decide how much. Some of them are family members. I don't always get the choice if I'm a kid and I live at home with these parents or something like that, but I can choose what to pay attention to that they're doing versus no, I know that there's a different sort of way or a different sort of thinking that I get from maybe a healthy teacher or a grandparent or something like that too.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, that there really is that continuum in, toxicity versus not being toxic, or safety versus unsafety, if you will. And so we're all on that continuum. Hopefully most of us are more on the safety side.
The
We're
healthy
safe
side,
people, we're
safe,
healthy
yeah.
people. But, even as you listen to this podcast and what we're going to be talking about today, I want to encourage our listeners, really try to soak it in and don't get, defensive or upset if you see some of these characteristics in yourself. We all have things to work on, including myself. Even as we go through this list, I'm like, yeah, I could, do a little better in this area. And that's not a bad thing, right?
Yeah. And even when we diagnose people with disorders, mental illness and disorders and stuff, we don't go, oh, here's this one trait, they're automatically this. They have to have so many characteristics of it before, like maybe 6 out of 9 or 5 out of 7 or something like that. You don't just automatically get diagnosed because you have a trait. That just tells you, oh, I need to pay attention to see if there are other traits also a part of this cluster or symptomology. And then that helps me keep my eyes open just as I'm interacting with this person.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one other thing I want to add too is that even though there is risk when it comes to relationship, right? And so maybe their temptation when we look at all these unsafe behaviors that we can run into is just to say, you know what? I don't think it's even worth it. I'm just going to kind of hide myself out and stay away from the possibility of getting hurt. But I think that old saying is very true. It's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. In other words, it's better to have loved and have the risk of being hurt, because even though relationships can be our greatest sources of pain, they are also our greatest sources of meaning in life as well.
And yeah, I have another way of looking at it too, which is the same thing. Like I can protect myself from all of those things, all of those hurts and injustices and everything, but I'm also protecting myself from the joy of having true healthy relationships too. And I don't want to protect myself so much that I don't have those things too. So
it's worth the risk, right?
It's worth the risk.
But it's important to be aware so we can take a calculated risk and minimize the amount of pain that we're going to experience or repeat, because that's part of the problem too. And I think you already alluded to this earlier, but for a lot of us, especially if we've experienced negative relationships in the past, it becomes actually very difficult to recognize healthy versus unhealthy in the future. We're actually tend to be drawn naturally, even oftentimes, to unhealthy behavior if that's what we've experienced in the past. So we have to become very aware and intentional.
And it becomes normalized to us and sometimes even comfortable to us. So we keep going back to that same behavior. And I'm already feeling a bit of anxiety as we start this topic, because I know for some people on one end of the spectrum, they're going to go, well, I see this in everybody that I experience. And then other people are going to listen to this and go, oh, well, I just need to be nicer to people and give them another chance when they're difficult and dangerous and toxic and everything. So yes, please pay attention and then try to grow as you practice seeing these things in people and noticing these things too.
Yeah, and this is actually where I think getting some input from someone that is kind of like, if you're wondering, okay, I'm thinking about getting into a relationship with this person, whether it's a good friendship or a romantic relationship, but I have some baggage and I know I haven't always made the best relationship choices in the past. And now I'm more aware of like what's safe and unsafe, but I still it still can get fuzzy. It's so helpful to have someone, whether it's a good therapist or a good friend or family
Mm-hmm.
member that you can trust and that really has a level head on their shoulders that can kind of
Yeah.
give you some feedback.
Absolutely. And that works even for healthy people to have other people because
Yes.
sometimes, infatuation can take over. You're not seeing straight and everything. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, why don't we have four main categories that we wanted to
Mm-hmm.
talk about. And so why don't we get into those categories of unsafe people or toxic people
Mm-hmm.
so that we can understand that better. So Amanda, why don't you go
Yeah.
ahead with the first
So
one?
the first one, well, let's just call it defensiveness. One of the features of somebody who is not very healthy or toxic or unsafe would be somebody who's very defensive. Now, we all naturally have a tendency, if somebody calls us out or criticizes us or gives us constructive criticism, to not want to hear that. I mean, our egos kind of get in the way. But if you notice, I like to say a patternistic defensiveness. Like if you bring something up and they're automatically going for the defense. And even if they go for the jugular, they turn it now against you. That can be
Mm,
a part of the defense too. I'm not willing to look at what you're saying and notice it, provided you said it in a healthy way and you have a healthy perspective of it. But to automatically get defensive and that be a pattern in the confrontation, then that would definitely be a sign of a toxic person.
yeah, and it's interesting because I'm also thinking in a way of the opposite. And my grandpa is one that comes to mind. And I've seen with him, uh, again, I would say he's more the opposite end of the spectrum, extremely open. And even if somebody's attacking him, instead of getting defensive, he'll be like, you know what, let me take a step back and like think about that. Maybe you have a point. But I think for the people that are more unsafe, it's this automatic no, that there could be nothing wrong with me. It must be with you, or blaming someone else or some situation, right? There's kind of refusal. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I definitely think it comes from potential of shattered pride.
Mm,
I don't want to have to focus on things that maybe feel shameful to me,
hmm
and many of us haven't learned how to deal with criticism. Some of us believe that when somebody says something is wrong or not working in the relationship, that it means there's something innately, deeply wrong with who I am versus, hey, this might have worked in other relationships, but for me, this doesn't work, or it doesn't feel right, or
hmm
it doesn't seem helpful, or something like that. And to be able to step back and go, oh, I don't like hearing that I have faults, but I could see how that might be a problem for them. And maybe this relationship is important enough to me that I would be willing to work on that to make them feel safe.
So it sounds like there's often a very deep-seated sort of insecurity
Mhm.
there, which if you see like maybe some of these weaknesses, then maybe some of my own insecurities and fears are kind of
Mhm.
validated, and that can really make me fall to pieces in a way. So
Yeah.
it seems like from what you're saying, at least for some people, it's actually a very fragile sense of like identity and yeah, just not having that sense of security that
Mhm.
makes them defensive.
Yeah, and the difference between guilt and shame is guilt is like a part of something that I'm doing versus
Hmm
the whole of who I am. And so some people take those things very, very internally, and it just gets so absorbed in every part of them. And so they can't look at it in an objective way and say, oh, okay, I can see, yeah, that wasn't the nicest thing I could have said, or the way I said it was probably a
Mm.
little more hurtful and stuff. Let me try again this time, or let me try again next time even and do it differently. But that's the part of defensiveness, is that there is either no ability to recognize fault or very little ability to recognize fault. And in addition to that, the defensiveness also, maybe the person does go, okay, sorry about that. But you see, like, wait, I don't see any processing of the information. They just sort of passed it off like no big deal.
Mhm.
And then you don't see any change later. So
Mm.
some people might not seem very defensive at first, but then you don't see a change
So there
after
might
the
be an
apology.
apology, but
Yeah.
there's no behavioral change
Yeah.
that
It's
follows.
like,
So it's not
okay,
a real
I'm
genuine.
sorry. just a plain sorry. One of the things I like to do, I know this is probably a little controversial, but I like if somebody apologizes to me and I sense like it's a quick sort of like get off my back kind of thing, what I've done before is I've said, "What are you sorry for?" And sometimes they look at me like, "What are you talking about? I just said I'm sorry. You told me something was wrong." And I said, "Well, I know what I think you should be sorry for, but I don't know what you think you should be sorry for or what you think you're sorry for." And then usually I already knew like this isn't going to go well. And then I didn't get a very good response, or that person shows like very deflectively, "I don't want to deal with this."
Lesson learned. Be careful when you apologize to Amanda. And she might also ask you, well, so what are you going to change, right?
Yeah. Or, what can we do differently? Are you willing to do this differently or something like that? I have to say, I don't have too many times that I get to utilize that happily, but I have done that before because I wasn't sure if the person was really apologetic because it didn't seem like it passed the tip of the ears and that sort of thing.
Pretty shallow.
Yeah, it was a very quick and shallow response.
So what's the second category as far as unsafe or toxic people?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me add one more thing
Sure.
with defensiveness too, is sometimes defensiveness can turn into even go so far as gaslighting. So it's not just that I don't want to hear what you have to say and I push it off or I deflect it, but now I'm going into actually tearing you down, making you think that you must be crazy for even bringing it up in the first place, or belittling your intelligence or your perspective on what's going on. That is another, and that's a really toxic situation. Sadly, though, I find a lot of people learn this in their families. It's almost like a trained behavior to gaslight. Well, you did this and you did that and you're stupid and you can't do anything. So how should I ever believe you? And so it causes the person to go, "Why did I even bring it up?"
Yeah. The blame game, it's so natural. And we see it even, from the very beginning, right? With Adam and Eve, they just, no, it's your fault. But it goes to that point, like you said, where it actually is making the other person in the end feel like, oh, maybe I'm the one that's crazy
maybe there's
or whatever.
something wrong with me that I brought it up, because they're saying that there is something wrong with me, but that I brought it up. And I always like to say, well, what was the behavior that started the conversation? Focus on what the behavior is, not the response from the person or the reaction for the person. Why did I bring this up in the first place? Has that changed? No. So it's defensiveness.
Oh, that's really helpful. All right. So what's another category?
Well, the next one is boundaries. And this is when the person doesn't have any respect for boundaries or very little respect for boundaries. Boundaries are really helpful. It's what keeps relationships on track, going in the right direction, but it's what keeps relationships safe. I know what to expect from you. You know what to expect from me. And so when I suggest a boundary based on behavior or something that's important to me, that I'm considering that it could be very well good for you too. And that person, if they're toxic or unsafe, will suggest that you're ridiculous for having that boundary. That, oh, you're just limiting freedom. And I know a lot of people talk about freedom today. Like, we love talking about, I just want to be free and do whatever I want. But imagine if you could drive as fast as you want all the time, whenever you are or wherever you are, and you're going through a school zone. The freedom to be able to drive how you want doesn't keep you from the consequences of hurting somebody. And while that may hurt them physically and their family emotionally, it'll hurt you too if you have any sense of conscience, like to know, wow, I was responsible for that. And so where my freedom impedes on your freedom, that's where a boundary needs to be made.
So how do we recognize when someone might be kind of stepping over those freedom boundaries, and we might need to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, yeah, this person is actually trying to control me or really go over those boundaries.
Yeah, and so that's the thing with boundaries is that I can implement the boundary saying I'm the safe, or I'm the person that's wanting to have safe relationships, and that other person can either not have any respect for those boundaries, I like to say, if I really care about somebody and there's something that makes them feel a little bit better and it's within reason, why wouldn't I want to do that to respect the relationship? But on the other hand, that person might be toxic because they're the ones that get to create all the boundaries and all the rules in the relationship. And I don't have any say in what makes me feel better or good or something like that too. So the boundaries can go both ways. It can be too strong on the toxic persons and like rule after rule after rule and controlling, or it can also be that if I have a boundary that I want to implement, that, oh, that's ridiculous, that's stupid, nobody does that kind of thing.
Okay. So yeah, and it sounds like the common denominator is kind of like that person is really trying to control and take over the other person's freedom
Mhm.
of choice and really dictate the way that they live their
Mhm.
life instead of really encouraging that sense of freedom and true love flourishes, right?
Mhm.
And under conditions of freedom, it's actually this way of manipulating and trying to get them to do what I want them to do because
Yeah.
that's part of my agenda.
It's the difference between like a dictatorship or a teamwork situation.
Hmm.
Relationships should be about teamwork. And if one person's doing all the dictating, then it's not teamwork anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So, what can someone do? And I know this might be another topic, but if you're starting to recognize, like, ooh, this, I do sense that this person that I'm trying to have a relationship with, they're really pushing. It's maybe not like to the point where they're abusive or something,
Mhm.
but it just feels like I don't have that room to breathe.
Yeah.
Any,
One of the things I've noticed, and this is the way I know that maybe this is not a healthy situation, is when I start to recognize that I'm tiptoeing, that I'm not able to freely say, like, hey, that makes me uncomfortable. And I think, and I recognize in myself that when I'm getting that way, I'm probably recognizing that that person isn't going to be a healthy response or a responder to my boundary. And so I pay attention to that more so now because I realize if I'm tiptoeing, it's probably saying something about the relationship. But here's another thing that's important too. If I'm tiptoeing, sometimes it can be about other relationships, not necessarily this person. So I need to be careful that I'm not just taking past toxic relationship fears into this relationship, that it truly is about that person not being able to listen and hear and compromise.
oh, that's really helpful. Yeah. So, for our listeners, watch out for those boundaries. And again, a lot of us in life, we're working on developing better boundaries and how we interact with one another. And it's natural, I think, for us to want our way. So then, just naturally as human beings, we're going to try to kind of manipulate and control. But so it doesn't automatically mean if someone doesn't have the best perfect boundaries that we can't like be around that, but we just have to be aware of that and we work on that and we want to look at ourselves too, right?
Yeah, and I think so far the ones that we've talked about, defensiveness and boundaries, I've met people in my life, who maybe they were a little defensive at first, but they came back and apologized later. I
Hmm.
pay attention to that. Like I don't look just at the initial response sometimes, because sometimes there are healthy people that, you know, who's perfect? Who has
Exactly.
like the perfect upbringing? Very few people have just a wonderful disposition and know how to handle everything with ease, that don't have any social anxiety or any fears or anything like that. So pay attention to the whole of the person, not just that maybe that initial reaction, because there are some beautiful people in this world who haven't had the easiest time, but they're willing to grow. So maybe they start initially defensive overall or with a boundary, but later they come back and they say, hey, I'm really sorry, like I didn't mean to respond, I see what you mean now and I'm happy to work with you.
Yeah. I'm glad that we're all a work in progress.
Yes.
So what's the third one? So you had defensiveness, a lack of boundaries. What's the third one?
Pride. And this one has to do with I mean, these all kind of overlap in certain ways, so it's hard to. I mean, we could have one category, but it's just easier to break it down into four with topics. But this one is when the focus is really on me. Like a toxic person is not going to be us focused or we focused. They're going to be me focused, I focused, and so we have to be careful that if we notice, like, hey, I'm always the problem in this person's mind, no matter what I do, no matter how I try. I like to suggest, if you're playing a game with a, 4-year-old or something, the game can be quite self-focused for that 4-year-old. You cheated. Actually, I've played games with older kids too, where they said the same thing if I'm winning or whatever. You're cheating. And I'm like, I'm not cheating. There's no way to do that deceptively. You would see that, and they can't tell me why. But we don't like to be wrong. And so somebody who has a lot of pride is going to have a hard time being willing to let go of the I and the me and focus on the we.
Yeah. And that, I think we see a lot of that. And again, I'm like, ooh, there's times where I tend to.
Oh, yeah. This is so hard to say. Because I think, oh, man, I did that time or something like that. But really, we want to look at the recovery. We all have moments where we're I focused. I don't want to clean up that dish. Like you made the mess. Don't make me do that. But it's really like, am I able to sit back and recognize, like, yeah, I am being very self-focused. And another part of the pride too is when we're in a relationship with somebody who's exploitative. So they actually go to the next degree of actually pointing out all of our flaws or all of our problems. They don't give any grace. They're not forgiving. It's always just a racking up of offenses versus, hey, I recognize you're another human being. I'm not perfect. So the way you forgive me is the way I need to forgive you too. But in a toxic person, it's always going to be about me. Therefore, I'm going to exploit any problem, fault, discrepancy, whatever, to make you look bad.
Yeah. And it really makes me think it's kind of this ongoing pride versus like, okay, yeah, there were some proud moments, but then they saw that and they were willing to be humble and say, hey, I handled that wrong, or I also I make mistakes and this is what I did wrong. The prideful person, it's like, no, you're the problem and I got it all together. And it kind of reminds me of, in the Bible where it talks about the Pharisee, right? He was, oh God, I'm so glad that I pay tithe and, I fast twice a week and all and I'm not like this guy over here, right?
Yeah.
And the other way of looking at it is more of that, or the humility and being like, yes, I have problems, and that is a much safer way of doing it.
Yeah, like Paul said, I'm the worst of the sinners and stuff. And that doesn't mean, I know some people hearing that might think like, oh, I have to belittle myself in order to be a non-toxic person. But it's just recognizing who I am, where I am, and being willing to grow from there too. And I think that was Paul's point, is that he was willing to grow in the recognition of where he was at that point.
That's true, humility, right? So what about the fourth category?
The fourth category is interpersonal difficulty. These are people who tend to be very shallow in their interactions with others. And I know shallow can be a little deceptive because sometimes it looks like love bombing or extreme flattery, but it doesn't have much to back it. Like, I love you, you're the best person in the world. Well, why do you love me? You're just a great person, There's nothing tangible that they can really grab onto. And so you're like, wait, that doesn't feel like a compliment. It doesn't feel like a true understanding of who I am. But then on the other side, you can also get like really harsh gaslighting and put downs and confrontations and that sort of thing. So there's this instability, like you don't ever feel like you know where you rest in the relationship.
Yeah, so those interpersonal difficulties, and that really makes me see that it can be very difficult to actually connect in a healthy way with an unsafe person, like really have that intimacy. that
Yeah.
it really lacks at the end of the day.
Yeah, so it can look like lying and manipulation too. And sometimes manipulation doesn't always look like I'm trying to get you to do something really bad, but manipulation could look like something or look like I'm trying to get you to do something I want you to do that maybe isn't in the best interest of you, but I'm trying to make it look like it's in your best interest. Like the time I had somebody offer me a form for a video that we were doing. And the form was to sign off, like a waiver. And as I'm about to sign it, I'm trying to read it real fast because I wasn't given a lot of time. The person said, "Oh, this is going to give you a lot of attention and, money and everything like that." And I'm like, "Wait, I wasn't doing that for that reason, but why are you saying that now? Like, are you getting something out of this that I should know about?"
Red flag there, right?
Yeah. And so I mean, it came down to, I didn't think there was anything, bad about it, but it stopped me and made me think, like, is this really what I want out of this? And why are they having to say that, or why do they feel like they have to say that to get me to sign it or to, seal the deal, so to speak?
Yeah, so we've talked about these 4 different traits, overarching traits of unsafe or toxic people, which are the defensiveness, the lack of boundaries, the pride, and then the interpersonal difficulties. So as we think about that and we summarize our show for today, what would the opposite look like? What would a safe person look like when we're looking for safe relationships?
Yeah, that's a hard thing because who is ultimately all safe and stuff? Jesus is a good example
Yes.
for
The
sure.
only 100%
Yes,
safe one,
the
right?
only 100%, and thank goodness for him that we have like a good example of this.
And by the way, can I just interject
Yeah.
something real quick here? It reminds me, there's a verse in the book of John somewhere where it says, Jesus knew what was in the heart of man, so he did
Yeah.
not trust himself to any man. So this whole idea of like, Jesus understood that too. There was no 100% safe person in the world, and so he only entrusted himself 100% to the Father. Now that doesn't mean that he wasn't intimate and connected with many people, but there was a sense of like, yeah, but I also need to be careful because everyone sooner or later is going to let me down, right?
Yeah, and that's normal for people to
Yeah.
let us down, because how can any one person be everything to us that we need all the time in every circumstance? So I like to teach people that it's not about changing the other person or
Mhm.
making them be more safe. It's about helping me understand how to handle myself in situations with unsafe
I
people.
like that.
And if I can trust myself to handle that situation, then I don't have to worry who's safe or not safe, because I will be keeping my eyes wide open, not in a paranoid sort of way, but in a just, I'm awake when
Mhm.
I'm around people. I'm not letting every guard down and maintaining a completely vulnerable stance in those relationships. But I think with defensiveness, obviously the opposite of that is somebody who is humble, that is willing to recognize that they're not flawless,
Mhm.
And
And
now we have to
they're
be,
open,
yeah,
right?
they're open, and we have to be careful too. Like, I can be defensive about telling somebody that they're need to change something. And so they might be defensive in response to the way I'm saying it versus they're just a defensive, toxic
Mhm.
person. But if that person is able to hear and even say, I don't agree with you, but I'm willing to talk about this and figure out a way that you will be happy or something like that. That's what we want to look for in safe people, is that they're willing to listen if we have, a frustration with the relationship. And again, it doesn't mean they're always going to see eye to eye with us,
Mhm.
but they're not going to take that and go, "Well, I didn't do anything wrong. It's all you," sort of thing. With boundaries, a healthy person's going to recognize that
Yeah.
there are healthy times for boundaries.
Mhm.
With pride, I mean, obviously that humility to
Yeah.
be able to say, like, this isn't just about me. One of the mantras I like to consider for myself, just on a regular basis with people, is that people are dealing with me just like I'm dealing with them.
Mhm.
And what seems normal to me is because I only know me 100%.
Yes.
in all of my circumstances, but not everybody else is used to me or the type of me that I portray. And so they're dealing with me just like I'm dealing with them. And I want to deal with them with grace. And so that lets down a lot of that pride that my way is the only way to do things. I can listen to other people too. It doesn't even mean they have to be as good of an idea as mine, but I'm willing to let them try and do it their way because that's what you do in relationships.
There's this willingness to learn, this willingness to grow, right? Instead of saying, I got it all figured out.
So number 4, our last one is interpersonal instability. So really this boils down to, who do I get every time I'm with this person? Like, are they a different person? Do I wonder who I'm going to get? Or do I have a good sense that, like, hey, I know who I'm getting. This person is relatively stable. And I see, in the patterns in their life that they can handle things and then they're not going to fly off the handle and be moody and all that sort of thing. So that's what we want to look for, is that stability in the person. Like they are who they are the vast majority of the time.
Absolutely. And I so love what you said earlier, Amanda, about the whole idea of, when we are grounded and centered in our own relationship with God and we're secure, we can still be around even quote unquote unsafe or toxic people. It doesn't mean we need to spend a lot of time with them, but we can still be okay. And that's the beautiful thing. But it's important to recognize where our own boundaries are and how to deal with those sorts of situations, and then be choosy who we actually open up to and we trust. So thank you, Amanda, for sharing today.
You're welcome.
Just to remind you, our listeners, the top 4 traits to watch out for unsafe or toxic people, or is that defensiveness, the lack of boundaries, the pride, and then the interpersonal challenges and difficulties. So thank you for spending the time with us, and I hope that you will enjoy fostering better and better relationships for more and more joy. And remember, it is worth it, even though there is a risk of being hurt. It is so worth the risk when we find those amazing relationships with people that, even though they're not perfect, they're trying to do their best, and we're all growing by God's grace.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.